The Forgotten Warning. The great archive of the Keepers stretched endlessly into darkness, its crystalline walls holding the memories of 10,000 civilizations across 3 million years. Archon Thelsara moved through the corridors with practiced grace, her luminescent form casting soft blue light on records that predated most species in the galaxy. The Keepers were old, perhaps the oldest sentient species still active in galactic affairs, and they took their responsibility seriously. Every war, every peace, every rise and fall of empire was documented within these halls. Today she carried a sealed archive cylinder, something that had not been opened in over a century. The Galactic Assembly had requested it specifically, though Thelsara suspected they did not fully understand what they were asking to see. The assembly hall buzzed with hundreds of different languages and communication methods as representatives from across known space gathered for the monthly convocation. Thelsara observed them all from her position near the historical record station. There were the Qual, gaseous beings contained in elegant crystalline shells, the mordant insectoid philosophers whose compound eyes saw in spectrums most species could only imagine, the Yothrin collective, a hive mind that spoke with one voice through 1,000 bodies, and then there were the humans. They had joined the assembly only 15 years ago, though they had been trading with galactic civilizations for nearly 3 centuries. Thelsara studied them with interest. They were bipedal mammals, relatively short-lived compared to most spacefaring species, and physically unremarkable. Their technology was competent, but not exceptional. Their ships were efficient, but not innovative. Everything about them suggested a species that would remain a minor player in galactic affairs. Yet something about them made Thelsara uneasy. Perhaps it was how quietly they conducted themselves. Perhaps it was the careful way they negotiated treaties, always ensuring every word was precise. Or perhaps it was something she had read in the sealed archives, records that few living beings had ever accessed. The session began with standard matters of trade disputes and border negotiations. The human delegation, led by Ambassador Marcus Webb, participated minimally. Webb was a tall man with grey hair and calm eyes that seemed to absorb everything without revealing his thoughts. He voted on resolutions, offered brief comments when appropriate, and otherwise remained nearly invisible among the more vocal species. Then came the matter that had prompted Thelsara to bring the sealed archive. Supreme Commander. Vokhtar of the Tornax Confederation rose to address the assembly. The Tornax were a relatively young species, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 800 years ago, but they had expanded aggressively. They now controlled 42 star systems and possessed one of the largest military fleets in the galaxy. Vokhtar was massive even by Tornax standards, his scaled hide bearing the scars of countless battles. His people resembled what humans might call dragons, bipedal reptilians with powerful limbs and ridge-crested heads. Honored members of the assembly, Vokhtar began, his voice carrying easily through the translation systems. I come before you today to propose a restructuring of territorial assignments in the outer reach sectors. Several species currently claim territories they cannot adequately defend or utilize. The Tornax Confederation has both the resources and the will to properly develop these regions. Several smaller species shifted uncomfortably. Everyone understood what Vokhtar was really proposing. The Tornax wanted to expand their territory by absorbing the claims of weaker civilizations. It was not technically illegal under assembly law, provided the species in question agreed to the transfer, but it was aggressive nonetheless. The outer reach includes human settlements, Ambassador Webb observed quietly. Are you suggesting humanity cannot adequately defend or utilize our territories? Vokhtar's eyes fixed on the human delegation. I suggest nothing, Ambassador. I merely state facts. Your species controls 6 colonial systems in the outer reach. Your total military presence in that region consists of perhaps 40 vessels, most of them civilian freighters with minimal defensive capabilities. The Tornax maintain 300 warships in adjacent sectors. If you were to face any serious threat, you would be unable to respond effectively. And yet we have faced no threats in 300 years of peaceful exploration and trade, Webb replied. Perhaps aggressive military posturing is not the only path to security. Vokhtar's laugh was like stone grinding against stone. Peace exists only when all parties possess the strength to enforce it. Your species has survived this long because you have been fortunate enough to avoid conflict with any civilization capable of challenging you. That fortune may not last forever. The implicit threat hung in the air. Several species began speaking at once, some supporting Voktar's territorial proposals, others objecting. The chamber descended into controlled chaos as alliances and rivalries played out in real time. Thelsara chose this moment to activate her archive cylinder. The device projected a holographic seal into the center of the chamber, ancient symbols that predated most modern languages. The effect was immediate. The entire assembly fell silent. Archon Thelsara of the Keepers requests recognition, the assembly chairman announced, surprise evident in his translated voice. The Keepers rarely intervened directly in political matters. I apologize for the interruption, Thelsara said, her voice creating harmonic resonances that needed no translation. However, the current discussion has prompted me to present historical records that may be relevant to the Assembly's deliberations. The holographic seal dissolved, replaced by star charts showing a region of space that no longer appeared on modern navigation maps. Text began scrolling, written in a language so old that even the translation system struggled with it initially. 153 years ago, Thelsara began, there existed a civilization known as the Radical Empire. They controlled 68 star systems and maintained what was at the time the second largest fleet in known space. They were aggressive explorers and conquerors, having absorbed or destroyed 17 other species during their expansion. The hologram showed images of the Radical, a species of tall angular beings with metallic-looking skin and multiple articulated limbs. Their ships had been impressive, sleek, and deadly. The Radical encountered human colonies for the first time in the year 2872 by the current standard calendar. Humanity had been exploring space for approximately 150 years at that point. They had established colonies on 12 worlds and had made peaceful contact with 43 different species. New images appeared, showing early human settlements, small and vulnerable looking compared to the massive Radical installations. The Radical viewed human colonies as easy targets for resource extraction and territorial expansion. They attacked 3 human settlements in what they assumed would be a simple conquest. The first attack on the colony of New Providence killed 6,000 humans. The second attack on Horizon Station killed 12,000. The third attack on the mining colony of Deep Haven killed 8,000. The hologram showed the aftermath of these attacks, devastated settlements and dead populations. Several assembly members looked away, uncomfortable with the graphic nature of the historical records. The Radical anticipated human surrender, Thelsara continued. Instead, they received a single transmission from Earth. It consisted of one word in the Radical language, acknowledged. The chamber was absolutely silent now. Even Voktar had stopped his restless movement. What happened next is unclear. The historical records become fragmentary. What we know for certain is that within 8 months of that transmission, the Radical Empire ceased to exist. All 68 of their star systems went dark. Every Radical vessel, military and civilian, stopped responding to communications. When other species finally sent survey teams to investigate, they found the Radical infrastructure intact, but completely inoperable. Their populations were alive, but every piece of advanced technology they possessed had stopped functioning. Thelsara paused, letting that information settle. The Radical did not go extinct. They survived, but they were reduced to a pre-industrial civilization in a matter of months. Today, the Radical exist on 7 worlds, having regressed to an agrarian society. They remember their empire only as myth. When Keeper historians asked them what happened, they had no explanation. One day, their civilization simply stopped working. The hologram shifted to show current images of former Radical worlds, primitive settlements among the ruins of vast technological complexes. No other species claimed responsibility for what happened to the Radical. There were no witnesses to any battles, no debris fields, no evidence of weapons deployment, no records of human ships even entering Radical space. The Radical Empire simply collapsed, as if its entire technological foundation had been removed. The only connection was temporal. It happened during their conflict with humanity. Thelsara looked directly at Ambassador Webb. The human's expression had not changed. He watched the presentation with the same calm attention he gave everything else. The Keepers sealed these records at humanity's request, Thelsara said. Humans suggested that other species might find this history disturbing. They suggested that it might create unnecessary fear or misunderstanding. They suggested that it was better to let the radical be remembered as a cautionary tale about overextension rather than as an object lesson about the consequences of attacking human civilians. She turned to address the entire assembly. I present these records now because Supreme Commander Vokhtar has raised questions about humanity's ability to defend their territories. The historical evidence suggests that such questions may be based on incomplete understanding. Vokhtar's scales had paled slightly. You are suggesting that humanity somehow destroyed an entire civilization without leaving any evidence. That they possess weapons capable of rendering all technology inoperable across 68 star systems simultaneously. I am suggesting nothing, Thelsara replied. I am presenting historical facts. The interpretation is yours to make. Ambassador Webb stood slowly. Archon Thelsara, the Keeper archives are renowned for their accuracy. However, correlation does not always indicate causation. The collapse of the Radical Empire could have had many causes. Perhaps they suffered some internal technological catastrophe. Perhaps they encountered something in their exploration that disrupted their systems. Perhaps, Vokhtar interrupted, his voice harsh, we are expected to believe in ghost stories to make humans seem more formidable than they are. Where are these weapons the Keepers imply humans possess? Why have they never been used in the 3 centuries since the Radical incident? If humanity had such capabilities, why would they limit their expansion to a mere 6 colonial systems? Webb turned to face the Tornax commander. Commander Vokhtar raises valid questions. Humanity has indeed expanded slowly and peacefully. We have engaged in extensive trade but limited conquest. We have maintained a modest military focused on patrol and protection rather than projection of power. These facts speak for themselves. They speak of weakness, Vokhtar said flatly, not cunning. Then perhaps the commander will have no objection to the territorial arrangements remaining as they are, Webb replied. After all, if human territories are so poorly defended, they hardly represent a threat to anyone. There is no need to restructure the outer reach. Vokhtar's eyes narrowed. He had been outmaneuvered rhetorically, but his pride would not let him back down completely. The Tornax Confederation will take Keeper archives under advisement. However, we do not make policy based on ghost stories about empires that fell to their own incompetence. The session continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Several species that had been quiet now spoke up, suggesting that perhaps the current territorial arrangements were satisfactory after all. The Tornax found less support for their expansion proposals than they had anticipated. As the assembly adjourned, Thelsara approached Ambassador Webb in one of the side chambers. I apologize if presenting those records created difficulty for your delegation, she said. Webb smiled, though his eyes remained unreadable. Archon Thelsara, the Keepers have done us a service. Truth, even uncomfortable truth, is preferable to misunderstanding. The records I presented were incomplete, Thelsara said quietly. The full archive contains more details about what happened to the Radical. Details about how their technology failed in ways that suggested deliberate design rather than accident. Details about microscopic systems found in Radical equipment that appeared to be designed to receive external commands. Details about similar systems that Keeper researchers have found in technology throughout the galaxy. Webb's expression did not change. Fascinating. I assume such details remain sealed. For now, Thelsara replied. But I think you should know that someone has been accessing Keeper archives from external sources. Someone with very sophisticated intrusion capabilities has been copying records about the Radical incident. We cannot trace the source, but the access patterns suggest it originated from Tornax space. Webb nodded slowly. Thank you for informing me, Archon. I will ensure our diplomatic channels remain open should any further historical clarifications become necessary. As Thelsara watched the human ambassador leave, she felt the unease growing. The Tornax were aggressive but not foolish. If they had been researching the Radical incident, they must believe they had found some way around whatever had destroyed that empire. Either they thought they understood the threat and could counter it, or they believed the connection between humanity and the Radical collapse was coincidental. Either way, she suspected the galaxy was about to receive another object lesson in why some species survived the test of time, while others became cautionary tales in Keeper archives. In the Tornax war rooms, 3 sectors away, Supreme Commander Vokhtar studied holographic reports with growing satisfaction. His intelligence division had indeed been accessing Keeper archives, and their analysis was complete. The technology that had destroyed the Radical was based on embedded systems in trade goods and technological exchanges. If the Tornax avoided using any human-sourced technology, they would be immune to whatever weapon humanity possessed. It was almost disappointingly simple. Vokhtar began drafting orders for his fleet commanders. The Tornax would demonstrate to the galaxy that humanity's reputation was based on myth and fortune, rather than actual capability. They would seize human territories in the Outer Reach, and when humans protested, they would find that their mysterious weapons had no effect on a civilization that had carefully isolated itself from human technological influence. The commander did not notice the microscopic components in the very holographic projectors he was using, components that had been installed during routine maintenance by a contractor who had purchased supplies from a company that had purchased materials from another company that had, 15 transactions back, acquired raw materials processed by human mining operations. The invisible network was already in place, woven throughout Tornax civilization over decades of seemingly innocent trade. It simply waited for activation, patient as the species that had designed it. The catalyst, the freighter Prosperity's call, was 3 days out from the human colony of Far Haven when Tornax interceptors dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly in its path. Captain Elena Rodriguez barely had time to process the sensor readings before her communications officer shouted a warning. "Captain, we're being hailed. It's Tornax military. They're ordering us to cut engines and prepare to be boarded." Elena felt her stomach tighten. Prosperity's call was a civilian cargo hauler, carrying agricultural equipment and medical supplies to Far Haven. They had no weapons beyond basic meteor defense systems. The Tornax interceptors, by contrast, were bristling with enough firepower to reduce her ship to atoms. "Open a channel," she ordered, keeping her voice steady. "Tornax vessels, this is Captain Rodriguez of the human freighter Prosperity's call. We are on a registered trade route carrying civilian cargo. Under assembly law, you have no jurisdiction to stop us in neutral space." The response came from Commander Thekval, whose scaled face filled Elena's view screen. "Assembly law applies only to civilizations capable of defending their interests. Your ship will be seized as a spoil of war. Your crew will be evaluated for potential use." War? Elena's blood ran cold. The Tornax Confederation and humanity are not at war. "We have no dispute. As of 6 hours ago, the Tornax Confederation has claimed all human territories in the Outer Reach. Your colonies have been notified. Your government has been given 48 hours to acknowledge Tornax sovereignty over these regions. Your ship happened to be in Tornax space when this declaration was made." The communications cut out. Elena watched helplessly as Tornax boarding craft launched from the interceptors. She had 43 crew members, including 8 civilians traveling to Far Haven to join family members. None of them had any military training. None of them had any way to resist what was coming. "Send a distress signal," Elena ordered. "Broadcast on all human frequencies. Make sure they know." The ship's systems flickered and died. The Tornax had deployed some kind of electromagnetic pulse, disabling Prosperity's call without damaging its hull. Elena heard the metallic thuds of boarding craft attaching to her airlock. Then the screaming began as Tornax soldiers forced their way aboard. 3 hours later, Elena and her surviving crew members were chained in the cargo bay of a Tornax warship. 14 of her people were dead, killed for resisting or simply for being in the wrong place when Tornax soldiers decided to demonstrate their authority. The others were bruised, bloodied, and terrified. Commander Thekval walked among them, his claws clicking on the metal floor. "You will be transported to processing facilities where your usefulness will be determined. Those deemed capable of labor will be assigned to mining operations. The rest will be terminated efficiently." "The Assembly will not permit this," Elena said through swollen lips. "You're violating every treaty." Thekval's backhanded strike sent her sprawling. "The Assembly will do nothing. They are merchants and philosophers, not warriors. They will debate and issue statements while the Tornax take what we want. Your government will protest, then negotiate, then surrender. It is what weak civilizations always do. He gestured to his soldiers. Prepare them for broadcast. I want images of these humans sent throughout the galaxy. Let everyone see what happens when species rely on diplomacy rather than strength. What followed was broadcast across every major communication network in the galaxy. The Tornax did not simply kill the prisoners, they made a show of it, executing them one by one in front of recording devices while Thekful delivered speeches about Tornax superiority and the weakness of civilizations that relied on peace rather than power. Elena Rodriguez died last. Her final words broadcast to trillions of viewers across hundreds of worlds. Remember us. Remember what they did. Remember, the transmission ended with a burst of static. The reaction throughout the galaxy was immediate and chaotic. Some species condemned the Tornax actions in the strongest possible terms. Others remained silent, unwilling to provoke a civilization with such obvious military power. A few opportunistic governments began calculating whether Tornax aggression might create opportunities for their own territorial ambitions. The human response came within 6 hours. Ambassador Webb appeared at an emergency session of the Galactic Assembly. His face was composed, his voice calm, but something in his eyes made even the most aggressive species representatives feel a flicker of unease. The Tornax Confederation has killed 43 human civilians, Webb stated. They have broadcast these murders as entertainment and propaganda. They have declared sovereignty over human territories and given my government 48 hours to respond. He paused. And in that pause, the entire assembly held its collective breath. I am authorized to deliver humanity's response. We acknowledge the Tornax Confederation's declaration. We acknowledge their actions. We acknowledge that negotiation with a civilization that murders civilians for propaganda purposes is neither possible nor desirable. Webb looked directly at the Tornax delegation. Supreme Commander Vokhtar sat among them, his expression triumphant. He believed he had won, that humanity would now either surrender or engage in a conventional war they could not win. 48 hours from now, Webb continued, the Tornax Confederation will have an opportunity to experience what the Radical Empire experienced 153 years ago. I suggest that species with diplomatic, commercial, or territorial interests in or near Tornax space begin immediate evacuation procedures. Humanity assumes no responsibility for any losses incurred by those who choose to remain. The ambassador collected his materials and turned to leave. Chairman Velkoris of the Assembly called after him, Ambassador Webb, surely there is room for negotiation. The Assembly can mediate. Webb paused at the chamber entrance. With respect, Chairman, there is no negotiation with genocide. The Tornax made their choice when they broadcast the execution of my people for entertainment. Humanity has made our choice as well. Any species that wishes to understand what that choice means should review the Keeper archives regarding the Radical Empire. He left the chamber in absolute silence. Vokhtar stood, his face flushed with anger. Empty threats. The humans think they can frighten us with vague implications and ancient history. Let them try their tricks. They will learn that the Tornax are not the Radical. But as the Tornax delegation returned to their vessels, they found something disturbing waiting for them. Every ship in the Tornax fleet, military and civilian, had received the same message simultaneously, delivered through systems that should have been impossible to access remotely. The message was brief. You have 48 hours to evacuate all Tornax populations to designated safe zones. Coordinates are attached. Those who remain in Tornax space after the deadline will be considered enemy combatants. There will be no further warnings. The message was signed with a symbol that no Tornax had ever seen before, but that made Keeper archivists across the galaxy go very still when they saw it. It was the mark that had appeared on Radical equipment just before their civilization collapsed. A geometric pattern that seemed to shift and change depending on how you looked at it. In Tornax space, panic began to spread. Some military commanders dismissed the human warnings as bluffs. Others, remembering the presentation Archon Thelsara had given, began quietly moving their families to the outer colonies. The Tornax government declared that any civilian evacuation would be seen as cowardice and treason. Supreme Commander Vokhtar broadcast his own message to the Empire. The humans are desperate. They try to frighten us because they cannot defeat us. Any Tornax who flees based on human threats will be executed for cowardice. We will not abandon our worlds because a species of weak merchants makes empty threats. But beneath his public confidence, Vokhtar was troubled. His intelligence division was reporting unusual activity in human space. Civilian populations were indeed evacuating, but not in panic. The evacuations were orderly, methodical, and eerily calm. Humans were moving to designated shelter systems, with the efficiency of a species that had practiced this many times. More disturbing were the signals coming from deep space, sectors that humans had explored but never colonized. Massive power readings were appearing in these regions, energy signatures that suggested machinery awakening after a long dormancy. The readings were unlike anything in Tornax databases, technology that seemed to violate known physics. What are they activating? One of Vokhtar's intelligence officers asked, staring at the sensor data with growing alarm. The commander had no answer. None of his advisors had answers. The technology humans used in their public ships and trade was conventional, based on principles that every spacefaring civilization understood. This was something else entirely, something that had been hidden in the dark spaces between stars. As the 48-hour deadline approached, other species began evacuating from Tornax space, despite official protests from the Tornax government. The Yothrin Collective withdrew all diplomatic personnel. The Qual closed their embassy and departed with unusual haste. Even the Mordant, usually slow to react to galactic affairs, removed their observers from Tornax worlds. Archon Thelsara sent one final message to Vokhtar, marked with the Keeper seal of historical urgency. Supreme Commander, I urge you to review what happened to the Vradical carefully. They too believed they were immune. They too thought they understood the threat. They too refused to evacuate. The difference between your civilization surviving and your civilization becoming another sealed archive in the Keeper halls may depend on decisions you make in the next few hours. Vokhtar deleted the message without responding. He would not show weakness. He would not allow fear to guide Tornax policy, and he certainly would not let a species of peaceful traders dictate terms to the greatest military power in this sector of the galaxy. 6 hours before the deadline, the first Tornax ship experienced system failures. The battlecruiser Dominance was on patrol near the human border when its main engines suddenly stopped responding to commands. Then its weapons systems went offline. Then life support began fluctuating. Within minutes, every system on the ship had failed. The vessel was left drifting, its crew alive but helpless, surrounded by technology that refused to function. Then it began happening to other ships. Not all at once, but spreading like a disease through the Tornax fleet. Vessels that had been operating perfectly suddenly found themselves dead in space, their crews trapped in metal coffins. Vokhtar watched in growing horror as his mighty fleet, ship by ship, became nothing more than debris drifting through the void. How is this possible? He demanded of his engineers. These ships have no human components. We specifically avoided any technology that could be compromised. His chief engineer's voice was shaking. Commander, we're finding embedded systems we never knew were there. They're in the raw materials we used to build the ships. The metals, the ceramics, the polymer components. Microscopic machines woven into the basic structure of everything we've constructed for the past century. A century? Vokhtar's voice was barely a whisper. They've been planning this for at least that long, Commander. Everything we've built, everything we've made, has these systems embedded in it. And now they're activating. On Tornax Prime, the homeworld of the Confederation, power grids began failing. Communication networks went dark. Transportation systems stopped functioning. Within hours, a civilization that spanned 42 star systems was reduced to isolated pockets of people trapped on worlds where nothing technological worked anymore. The last transmission to leave Tornax space came from Vokhtar himself, broadcast on emergency bands that still functioned. To the species of the galaxy, the humans were right. We should have listened. We should have evacuated. Tell others. Tell them that humanity does not make empty threats. Tell them. The transmission ended as the final communication systems in Tornax space fell silent. Where once there had been a vast civilization of billions, there was now only primitive survival. The Tornax were not dead, but their empire was gone, dissolved in less than a day by weapons they had never seen and could not fight. In the assembly hall, species representatives watched the catastrophic collapse of the Tornax Confederation in real time. Some were horrified. Others were calculating how this might benefit their own interests. All were now absolutely certain of one thing. Humanity was not weak, not peaceful by nature, and not to be threatened under any circumstances. Ambassador Webb addressed the assembly 49 hours after his previous statement. The Tornax Confederation committed acts of genocide against human civilians. They have received a proportional response. Their civilization will survive, but will pose no threat to anyone for several generations. Humanity considers this matter closed. You destroyed them without firing a shot, Chairman Velcoris said quietly. You collapsed an entire civilization without visible warfare. We removed their capacity to harm others, Webb corrected. The Tornax are alive. Their worlds are intact. Their populations survived. They simply no longer have access to technology that could be used for conquest or genocide. In a century or two, when they have rebuilt, they may rejoin galactic civilization. Perhaps they will be wiser then. The ambassador looked around the chamber. Humanity has no interest in conquest or dominance. We prefer trade and cooperation, but we will not allow attacks on our civilians to go unanswered. We will not negotiate with those who commit genocide, and we will not limit our response to conventional warfare when facing existential threats. The choice of peace or catastrophe has always belonged to those who might attack us. Choose wisely. The unraveling Dr. Sarah Venn had been studying xenotechnology for 20 years, but she had never seen anything like the microscopic systems she was examining through her quantum microscope. The sample came from a Tornax battlecruiser, recovered from the edge of what had been Tornax space. Under magnification powerful enough to see individual atoms, she could make out intricate geometric patterns woven through the ship's hull material at the molecular level. "It's beautiful," her assistant Tom whispered. "Like crystalline structures, but they're definitely artificial." Sarah nodded, adjusting the microscope's resolution. "These are manufacturing nodes. See how they're distributed evenly through the material. They can receive instructions and modify the molecular structure of whatever they're embedded in. When activated, they can make metal behave like glass, ceramics like liquid, polymer bonds like dust. How did humans get these into Tornax materials?" Tom asked. The Tornax were paranoid about avoiding human technology. Sarah pulled up a three-dimensional projection showing trade routes and material flows across the galaxy over the past century. The Tornax purchased raw materials from the Qual, who purchased them from the Mordant, who purchased them from a dozen different intermediary species. If you trace the supply chain back far enough, nearly every industrial material in the galaxy passes through processing facilities that have some connection to, however distant, to human commerce. Tom stared at the projection. "That's impossible. No species could engineer a supply chain contamination across the entire galaxy." "Not impossible," Sarah corrected. "Just incredibly patient and thorough. These nodes are self-replicating at extremely slow rates. A tiny amount of contaminated material introduced into a processing facility would gradually spread through that facility's entire output over years or decades. Those materials would then be sold, used, processed further, and spread even more widely." She zoomed in on a single node. "The truly brilliant part is that they're completely inert unless activated by a very specific signal. They don't interfere with normal material properties. They don't show up on standard scans because they're small enough to look like natural impurities in the material. You'd have to be specifically looking for them at the quantum level to even notice they exist. So humanity has been preparing for something like this for a century." Tom sounded incredulous. "Who plans that far ahead?" Sarah thought about the question carefully. "A species that has learned from experience, species that has faced extinction threats before and decided never to be vulnerable again. A species that thinks in generational timeframes rather than political cycles." She pulled up another display, this one showing historical records from the Keeper archives that had been declassified after the Tornax collapse. "Look at this. After the Vradical attacked human colonies 150 years ago, humanity spent the next 50 years completely rebuilding their industrial base. They replaced every manufacturing facility, updated every processing system, redesigned their entire approach to materials science. The records showed schematics of human facilities from different eras. The changes were subtle but comprehensive. They weren't just improving technology. They were embedding these nodes into everything they produced. Every ship, every building, every piece of equipment manufactured by humans after year 2920 has these systems built in at the molecular level. Tom pulled up another section of the records. But humans trade extensively with other species. That means every species that has commercial relationships with humanity has these nodes in their technology too. Sarah nodded slowly. Every species except humans themselves, ironically. Look at this. She highlighted a section of code embedded in the nodes. These systems are programmed to recognize human DNA at the molecular level. They won't activate in the presence of human biology. But for anyone else, they're potential kill switches woven into the fabric of their entire civilization. The implications were staggering. Every species that traded with humanity, which was virtually every species in the galaxy, had these systems embedded in their infrastructure. They all existed at humanity's mercy, whether they knew it or not. But the Tornax specifically avoided human technology, Tom protested. They thought they were immune. They avoided direct technology transfer, Sarah agreed. But they couldn't avoid the materials. Unless they wanted to mine and process every raw material themselves, starting from scratch. They were dependent on galactic supply chains that humanity had quietly contaminated decades ago. She pulled up sensor data from the Tornax collapse. Watch how it spread. The first failures were in ships and facilities closest to human space. Then it cascaded inward, system by system, as the activation signal propagated through Tornax territory. The signal itself was transmitted through quantum entanglement in the nodes, faster than light, impossible to block or intercept. Tom watched the progression on the holographic display. The Tornax Confederation had collapsed in waves, each wave triggered by nodes activating and sending signals to other nodes deeper in their territory. How long would it take to remove these systems from a civilization's infrastructure? Generations, Sarah said quietly. I would have to identify every contaminated material, which would require quantum-level scanning of literally everything. Then you'd have to carefully remove or neutralize the nodes without destroying the material's structural integrity. And you'd have to do this for every ship, building, tool, device, and piece of equipment in your entire civilization. She brought up an analysis of Tornax technology. The alternative is what the Tornax are facing now. Revert to pre-industrial technology and start over from scratch. Mine your own ores, smelt your own metals, manufacture everything locally without relying on galactic supply chains. It would take centuries to rebuild. Tom was silent for a long moment. The Keepers must have known. They have to have examined materials from across the galaxy. Sarah pulled up a communication from Archon Thelsara, marked with Keeper seals. They knew. They've known for decades. Look at this message to the Assembly from 30 years ago. She read aloud. The Keepers have observed certain anomalies in manufactured materials across galactic civilization. These anomalies appear harmless and do not interfere with material performance. However, their origin and purpose remain unclear. Further investigation is recommended. That was a warning, Tom realized. A very careful warning, Sarah agreed. The Keepers couldn't directly accuse humanity without proof of hostile intent. And the nodes truly were harmless until activated. They still are harmless for species that maintain peaceful relationships with humanity. The Keepers were essentially saying, we see what you did, we understand why you did it, and we're documenting it for historical purposes without interfering. She pulled up another Keeper document. They also noted that human materials are completely clean. Humans don't contaminate their own infrastructure. The nodes are exclusively in materials destined for external trade. That suggests the system is defensive rather than aggressive. It's meant to protect humanity from external threats, not to enable human conquest. Tom studied the data for a long time. So every civilization in the galaxy is dependent on human goodwill for their continued existence. One activation signal, and any species could face what happened to the Tornax. Not quite, Sarah corrected. The nodes require regular refresh signals from human sources, to remain viable. Without those signals, they degrade and become inert over several decades. Species could theoretically isolate themselves from human trade for 30 or 40 years, and the nodes would eventually break down naturally. But in that time, they'd have to rebuild their entire industrial base without access to galactic supply chains, Tom observed. Most civilizations would collapse economically long before the nodes degraded, Sarah nodded. That's the real genius of the system. It's not a direct threat. It's mutual dependence engineered at the molecular level. As long as species maintain peaceful relations with humanity, they benefit from trade and technology exchange. But any species that chooses to attack humanity finds themselves literally trapped in a cage they built with their own hands, using materials humanity provided. The door to the laboratory opened, and Ambassador Webb entered, accompanied by 2 security officers. Sarah and Tom immediately stood, surprised by the unexpected visit from such a high-ranking official. "Dr. Venn," Webb said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used in the assembly. "I understand you've been analyzing Tornax materials recovered from the collapse." Sarah nodded carefully. "Yes, Ambassador. We're documenting the embedded systems for the scientific record." Webb walked to the quantum microscope and studied the display showing the molecular structures. "What you're looking at, Doctor, is the reason humanity has survived every conflict we've encountered in the past 3 centuries. It's also the reason we will likely never face another conventional war." He turned to face them both. "I'm here to ensure you understand the classification level of your research. What you've discovered cannot be published, discussed publicly, or shared with non-human species. The knowledge of how these systems work must remain exclusively within human scientific and military circles." "I understand, Ambassador," Sarah said. "But may I ask a question?" Webb nodded. "The Keepers know. Other species will eventually figure it out. How long can this remain secret?" Webb's expression was thoughtful. "The Keepers have known for decades and chose to issue only oblique warnings. They understand that this system, while concerning, has prevented countless wars. No species wants to attack humanity if it means facing technological collapse. The result is that humanity, and by extension our trading partners, exist in a state of enforced peace." He gestured to the display. "As for other species figuring it out, that's inevitable. Some already suspect, but understanding that the systems exist is different from understanding how to remove them or create them. The quantum engineering required to produce these nodes is extremely advanced. We're perhaps 50 years ahead of the next most sophisticated civilization in this specific field." Tom spoke up hesitantly. "Ambassador, doesn't this make humanity look like tyrants? We've essentially rigged the entire galaxy to collapse at our command." Webb considered the question seriously. "That's one interpretation. Another is that we've created a system that makes attacking humanity irrational from a game theory perspective. The Tornax could have chosen to evacuate. We gave them 48 hours warning, which was 48 hours more than they gave the crew of Prosperity's call. They chose to believe we were bluffing." He pulled up another display, showing casualty figures. "In the century and a half since we implemented this system, there have been 0 successful attacks on human civilian populations that went unpunished. But more importantly, there have been only 2 attacks total, the Vradical and the Tornax. Every other species has chosen peaceful coexistence." Sarah understood what he was saying. "You're arguing that the system has saved lives by preventing wars before they start." "I'm stating a fact," Webb corrected. "Before we implemented these safeguards, humanity was attacked 17 times in 200 years. Since implementation, we've been attacked twice in 150 years. The mathematics are clear. This system works as a deterrent." He walked to the door, then paused. "Dr. Venn, your research will be invaluable for future defensive planning. But I need you to understand something. These nodes, this entire system, it's not something we wanted to create. It's something we had to create after watching too many of our people die in conflicts that could have been avoided if other species simply chose not to attack civilian targets." After Webb left, Sarah and Tom sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Tom spoke. "Do you think he's right? That this system prevents wars?" Sarah pulled up historical data, comparing attack frequencies before and after the system was implemented. The numbers supported Webb's argument. "The data says yes, but I wonder about the cost. We've created a galaxy where every civilization exists at our mercy, even if most of them don't realize it. Better than a galaxy where we exist at their mercy, Tom said quietly. The Tornax prove that some species will commit genocide if they think they can get away with it. Sarah couldn't argue with that. She had seen the broadcasts of the Prosperity's call crew being executed. She had read the reports of how the Tornax planned to process human prisoners for labor and entertainment. I suppose the question isn't whether the system is moral. The question is whether any alternative would be better. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, other species were reaching similar conclusions. In the Qual sovereignty, philosophers debated the ethics of humanity's defensive strategy. Some argued it was a form of technological tyranny. Others countered that it was simply evolution of deterrence doctrine, no different than previous species maintaining large military fleets to discourage attacks. In the Mordant Assembly, analysts were calculating how long it would take to identify and remove all embedded nodes from their infrastructure. Their conclusion was sobering: approximately 200 years of intensive effort, assuming they could even develop the technology to detect and neutralize the systems without causing catastrophic failures. The Yothrin Collective, with their hive mind's ability to process vast amounts of data simultaneously, reached perhaps the most pragmatic conclusion. They issued a formal statement. The Yothrin acknowledge humanity's defensive capabilities. We note that these capabilities have never been used against species maintaining peaceful relations with humanity. We conclude that continued cooperation and trade with humanity remains in our collective interest. It was a carefully worded way of saying, we know what you did. We understand why you did it, and we're choosing not to make an issue of it because the alternative would be worse. But not every species was willing to accept the new reality so calmly. In the outer regions of the galaxy, several civilizations began forming what they called the Independence Collective. Their goal was to create a completely isolated economic and technological sphere, free from any dependence on human trade or materials. The Zelkan Principality led this effort. Prince Vormis addressed his people with passion. We will not live under the sword of Damocles that humanity has suspended above the galaxy. We will mine our own materials, build our own infrastructure, and trade only among ourselves. It may take generations, but we will be truly free. Human observers watched these developments with interest but no apparent concern. Ambassador Webb, when asked about the Independence Collective during an assembly session, simply said, "Every species has the right to determine their own path. If the Zelkan and their allies wish to pursue economic isolation, that is their choice. Humanity will respect it." What Webb didn't say, but what human intelligence analysts knew, was that complete economic isolation on a galactic scale was nearly impossible. The Independence Collective would discover that raw materials existed in complex supply chains, that certain elements were rare and localized. That true self-sufficiency would require access to resources scattered across vast distances. They would also discover that their existing infrastructure was already contaminated with nodes. Removing them would mean demolishing everything they had built and starting from scratch. The question was whether their political will could sustain that level of sacrifice for the decades it would require. Dr. Venn continued her research, documenting the node's properties and behaviors. She made one discovery that she felt compelled to report to Ambassador Webb directly. "The nodes have an unexpected property," she explained during a secure communication. "They're not just programmed to disable technology on command. They can also be used to enhance it." Webb's interest sharpened. "Explain." "The nodes can modify material properties in beneficial ways as well as destructive ones. They can make metals stronger, ceramics more heat-resistant, polymers more flexible. The same systems that can make a ship's hull crumble could also make it nearly invulnerable." She pulled up data showing the comparison. "I think this is how human ships have survived encounters where they should have been destroyed. We're not just using the nodes defensively against enemies. We're using them to enhance our own technology beyond what normal physics would allow." Webb was silent for a moment. "That information is classified at the highest level, Dr. Venn. How did you discover it?" "I was analyzing the hull material from a human patrol ship that survived a meteor strike that should have destroyed it. The nodes in the hull had activated and reinforced the material at the molecular level, distributing the impact force across the entire structure. It was like the ship's armor became fluid for just a moment, absorbing and redirecting the energy. Your observation is correct, Webb admitted. The nodes serve dual purposes: defensive denial of capability to enemies and enhancement of our own systems. This is why human ships can operate with smaller crews and less obvious armor than equivalent vessels from other species. Our materials are smart, responsive, and can adapt to threats in real time. Sarah felt a chill. So humanity isn't just ahead in quantum engineering. You're ahead in materials science, adaptive systems, and probably a dozen other fields that depend on this technology. We're ahead because we had to be, Webb said firmly. After 17 attacks in 2 centuries, we decided that being ahead was the only way to survive. We invested everything in developing technology that would make attacking us suicidal, and in developing defensive capabilities that would let us survive attacks long enough to implement countermeasures. He looked directly at her through the communication link. Dr. Venn, do you have children? The question surprised her. 2, a daughter and a son. I have 3 grandchildren, Webb said quietly. I want them to grow up in a galaxy where they can travel safely, where they can explore and discover and live without fear of species like the Tornax deciding human civilians are easy targets. Everything we've built, all the systems you're documenting, it's about making sure our descendants don't have to face what previous generations faced. Sarah understood. You're not trying to dominate the galaxy. You're trying to make it safe enough that dominance isn't necessary. Exactly, Webb agreed. If every species knows that attacking humanity means losing everything, then every species will choose not to attack. It's not tyranny if the choice remains with them. We're just making sure the consequences of choosing violence are clear and immediate. After the communication ended, Sarah sat in her laboratory thinking about families, about safety, about the price of peace. She thought about the Tornax, now reduced to agrarian civilizations, their populations alive, but their empire gone. She thought about the Radical, who had become myths to their own descendants. And she thought about the 43 crew members of Prosperity's Call, who had died for the crime of transporting agricultural equipment and medical supplies. In the end, she concluded that Webb was right. The system wasn't perfect, wasn't comfortable, and certainly wasn't pretty. But it worked. And in a galaxy where some species still viewed genocide as an acceptable tool of policy, having a system that worked was more important than having a system that felt morally pure. The Independence Collective would discover this reality soon enough. Either they would succeed in creating a truly isolated economic sphere, which seemed increasingly unlikely as they encountered the practical difficulties of self-sufficiency, or they would eventually rejoin galactic commerce and accept that peace with humanity was preferable to isolation from humanity. Either way, the galaxy had learned its lesson. Humanity was no longer the vulnerable species that the Radical had attacked centuries ago. They were no longer the easy target that the Tornax had assumed they would be. They were something else now, something that looked peaceful but carried weapons woven into the fabric of galactic civilization itself. They were survivors who had learned from experience, who had prepared for threats that hadn't yet emerged, who had built defenses so comprehensive that war became irrational for potential enemies. And that, Sarah realized, was perhaps the most human thing of all: to face extinction and respond not with surrender or despair, but with patient, methodical preparation that turned vulnerability into strength. If you think humanity has what it takes to dominate the galaxy, hit that like button and subscribe. How do you think Earth would react if a species dared to challenge us? Let us know in the comments below. Comment for next part.